Good to see you all tonight. Everyone, welcome. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and get started tonight with a few prayers. One thing that we're going to recite before each of these classes on Wisdom of Emptiness is the Heart Sutra. This isn't going to be a full kind of commentary on the Heart Sutra as part of this course, but I will talk about some parts of it here and there. And it's a very powerful prayer because it, of course, encapsulates. It's called the Heart Sutra because it's the essence of these teachings on emptiness. And then it's also very powerful, it's said, to remove obstacles. So let's start with that. You do have this, by the way, as part of the handouts that are at the course materials. I'll talk a little bit later about the course materials. Whoops, somehow clicked on something wrong there. Okay. So again, let's just recite this. And even if you have no knowledge of emptiness at all at this point, just try to bring to mind what these words are saying and reflect on them as we recite them together. The Heart of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. Thus did I hear at one time the Bhagawan was dwelling on massive Vulture's Mountain in Rajagriha, together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagawan was absorbed in the concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then, through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara: how should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Sharadvatiputra: Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element, and so on, up to and including no mind element and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on, up to and including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration and without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the end point of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly, completely awaken to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment in reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering, should be known as truth, since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared. Tayata Om Gate Gate Paragate Parasamgate Bodhi Swaha. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagawan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage. It is like that. It is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom, just as you have indicated. Even the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagawan, having thus spoken, the Venerable Sharad Vadiputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, those surrounding in their entirety, along with the world of gods, humans, asuras, and Gandharvas, were overjoyed and highly praised that spoken by the Bhagawan. And let's just do the refuge prayer, and we'll do a mandala offering. Actually, let's go ahead and do the mandala offering first then. And this is very traditional to do a sort of offering at the beginning of a course to kind of create that karma, to be able to receive blessings through these teachings, to actualize them in our own minds for the benefit of others. So let's recite this with the visualization of offering the entire purified, phenomenal world. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Hidam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryata Yami. And refuge in bodhicitta. And I guess most people know the Tibetan melody for this. Yeah, so we'll do it the first time in English, bringing the meaning of these words to mind, of taking refuge and generating the mind of bodhicitta, which was just a few modules ago that you worked with how to develop bodhicitta. And then we'll recite it twice into the Tibetan after that. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la, jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi, daki chunyan gipe sanam gi, dola penchir sangye drupar shog. Sangye chodang soki choknam la, jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi, daki chanyan gipe sanam gi, dola penshir sangye drupar sho. All right, let's do a short meditation as well before we begin. We won't spend a lot of time in meditation tonight, but at least a few minutes to calm the mind. And next week, I'll actually be talking a little bit more about meditation, since it's an essential part of this module of realizing emptiness. But after a few minutes of just focusing on the breath, don't need to, I think, give you any more instruction than that. Most of you have a way of working with the breath that you prefer. So you can just do that. Then I'll come in and I'll lead you in a short reflection to set our motivation together for tonight's teaching. So I'll ring the chime here to begin the meditation. So now let's set our motivation for our time together this evening. And it's sometimes said that if we were to summarize what the Buddha taught, you can think in terms of two main results. The first one is what's called high status. This is taught in the initial stages of the path. It means using our time here that we have together, as well as this human life, to at least create the causes for a good rebirth. To recognize that we have an incredible opportunity with this human life to change our minds, to develop our qualities, to reduce our negative tendencies. And so we want to continue to have these opportunities. While we would like to achieve even greater results with this life, at least we want to be assured that there will be another life like this one in our next rebirth. So begin with that level of motivation. Then the other results that the Buddha taught can be summarized under the term definite goodness, certain goodness. While high status, a good rebirth, is a form of goodness, there's nothing definite or certain about it. We could very well fall from those upper states, the human realm, and experience the unfortunate states of the lower realms. We want a more definite goodness, something we can rely upon that will not change. And the first level of that the Buddha taught was liberation, meaning self-liberation, the ability that we have with this life to free ourselves from samsara, to attain our own personal nirvana, our freedom from suffering. This again will be something that if we are able to achieve it, will be certain and definite, will continue in perpetuity. So advance your motivation to that level, thinking that you're here for a much deeper cause, a more lasting cause. But then the other form of definite goodness goes beyond personal liberation. And this is where we strive to achieve our greatest potential, to become a Buddha for the sake of all beings. But it has to be motivated by that compassion for others, that desire to help others to be free from their suffering and to bring them to perfect happiness. That's the main motivation. But we recognize that to accomplish that task of benefiting others to that degree, we have to become a Buddha. If we don't achieve that state, we will be limited in what we can do. And when we attain Buddhahood, again, this too is a certain, a definite result that will go on until all sentient beings are free from suffering and have attained that same state. Buddhahood is a result that will be the fulfillment of our own potential, but moreover will help us to fulfill the potential of all beings and bring every one of them to complete Buddhahood. So this is the ideal motivation for these teachings on the wisdom of emptiness. So cultivate bodhicitta, that aspiration to become enlightened for the sake of all sentient beings. That way, everything we do here tonight becomes a cause for that greatest result. Hey, it's good to be back with all of you. I'm still teaching on Thursday nights, but this I think is the first Discovering Buddhism module I've done since 3 years ago. I think it was November of 2020. And I actually taught the same module, The Wisdom of Emptiness. So it seems to be my module. I don't know. For those of you who don't know me, I was the former resident teacher here at Tupten Norbuling, was here from 2006 as resident teacher until the end of 2020, I believe. I think that's how it went anyway. But yeah, I still live here in Santa Fe. I've been doing a number of other things, traveling a little bit now that things have opened up, but I'm very happy to be back with all of you. What I would like to do, I know it takes a little extra time of our teaching time, but I would like people to at least introduce themselves so that I have an idea of who you are, and then also your exposure to discovering Buddhism. In other words, if you've done a number of these modules, if you could let me know that, or if you've only done one or two, that's great. If you're brand new and this is your first module, that's perfectly fine as well. So kind of keep it limited to that, just introducing yourself and then a little bit about your background. So yeah, we got quite a range then of folks who are fairly new with DB, Discovering Buddhism. I'm just going to say a little bit about the program because I've been teaching it for quite a few years. We introduced this program probably about 20 years, a little over 20 years ago, into the FPMT. And it is certainly meant to be somewhat introductory. At the same time, obviously, with something like this, we deal with pretty heavy duty subjects, things that are a little more philosophical. But my goal through this is to use the terminology and what have you so you become familiar with it, but moreover, to make it very practical and to make it something that you can hopefully get your heads around a bit and have some taste of it. Again, it's one of the more profound subjects that the Buddha taught and does take some time and patience in order to kind of get to a place where you really make it, I don't know, a little harder hitting than just a superficial teaching. One thing I might mention, I'm going to go through some of the materials. We do have a course materials link at the website for this course. You may have seen it. If those of you who've been doing Discovering Buddhism before already know that those materials are out there, I've added some things of my own that I kind of use for structure around this. But anyway, I'll go through some of those later. One of the things that I used to do with folks when we would get together for the first of a series, such as this module on emptiness, is we would watch the video together. They were about, well, they did one for each of the 13 teaching modules of Discovering Buddhism. These were videos that were produced right around 20, 22 years ago. And they all have wonderful teachers from our tradition. They are all available to watch on YouTube. And I've put the link for the one for this in your materials handout. Well, actually, it's in the assignments handout. So just so you know, I would like you to watch that between now and next week. We won't watch it together tonight because I think it's probably okay. We've got enough material certainly to fill the time that we have together. Um, Generally, I would watch the video with folks, so it's a nice introduction to the topic. Nonetheless, it does contain some of the more intricate teachings sometimes, and certainly that's the case with this one on emptiness. But there are, again, some wonderful teachings that are available out on YouTube through FPMT's website that are all 13 of these modules. So let's go ahead and begin by just kind of talking about the context of this module in terms of discovering Buddhism. Since some of you are new, I do want to kind of give the overall structure, which I did a little bit in the motivation tonight. In Tibetan Buddhism, we're primarily working with what is called in Tibetan Lam Rim. Lam means path, and Rim has the idea of gradual or graded stages. The idea being that we go through the Buddha's teachings in a gradual way, kind of going through them one by one to integrate them into our minds. And this is a structure that's really quite wonderful. When I first came to Tibetan Buddhism, of course, I came through another sort of tradition, but they didn't quite have everything structured as well as this tradition does, what's called the Golok tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, the tradition that the Dalai Lama is taught in and so on, or trained in. So the idea is that with the Lam Rim, we have a very clear structure of how we take everything that the Buddha taught and make it into practical instructions for our lives. So there are a few preliminary topics in discovering Buddhism that aren't technically presented as part of the Lam Rim, but nonetheless, they're the foundation for everything that the Buddha taught and how we work with the teachings of the Buddha. So the very first two modules of Discovering Buddhism, just as a reminder for those of you who've done this before and kind of to let others know where this all starts, is mind and its potential, where we talk about mind, what is mind, and the potential that we all have to achieve amazing things, all the way up through Buddhahood, this incredible result that we can accomplish through having this mind. I will touch on that a little bit, but that module, again, is to give us the ballpark of what all of the Buddha's teachings are about, is changing our minds, working with our minds. The second of these introductory modules is what's called How to Meditate. And that's because, of course, the Buddha taught meditation as a skill that we need in order to change our minds. We can change our minds simply through listening to teachings like this to some degree. But to do the deeper change that we're talking about, we do need to have a deeper meditative practice. As I said earlier, we are going to be going into some of the deeper meditation practices next week, and not in a real deep way because we don't have tons of time to devote to it. But nonetheless, I do want to give you some exposure to that. So you're aware of kind of the more advanced ways that you can pursue deeper meditative practice. Those are the kind of, again, to get us in the ballpark of the Buddha's teaching. So modules 1 and 2 of Discovering Buddhism really just kind of set everything up. Then in module 3, we look at an overview of the entire Lam. It's called Presenting the Path. And it's essentially just going through what is the structure, kind of in a way that I'm doing tonight in a very brief way. You go into that over the course of 6 to 8 sessions, where you get an idea of what the entire rest of the Lam and the rest of Discovering Buddhism looks like. So the Lam is divided into 3 parts. Let me go ahead. I'm going to share some slides here. I put together just a few slides for tonight. And these slides, again, will be available out at the course material site after tonight. This is, again, just to give you the structure of how the Lam is set up. It does have its own preliminary teachings as well. The first of them being that we do rely on what we call our gurus, those spiritual teachers who we can use as a support on our study of the path. And then, of course, we also recognize the preciousness of this human life that we currently possess. Then we go into what's called there, again, the first of these 3 levels, the graduated path of the beings of small capacity. Let me take it off screen while I talk about that very briefly. So, having acknowledged that we have this incredible, perfect life, the very first topic that we encounter in the Lam is death and impermanence, is recognizing that this life isn't going to last forever. And we use it as an impetus to engage in the practice more wholeheartedly because we recognize that our time is not definite. Any one of us could die later tonight, later today. It's not certain that we even have another day in this human existence. The second topic that's taught in that kind of small area of the Lam, the person of the least capacity, having kind of, again, a mind that is not quite as developed to achieve some of the greater goals of Buddhism, is to acknowledge that if we don't do something with this human life, we could very well end up in an unfortunate existence. Whereas this is based on the concept of rebirth that the Buddha teaches, that is consistent with many of the Eastern traditions that teach that beings are reborn. There is a continuum of consciousness, and we go from life to life and so on. Well, the idea is at the end of this life, we could very well end up in an unfortunate existence. And so we have to be aware of that possibility. So we do something meaningful with this life. So we get the idea through studying our death that it has to happen soon, and then through studying the fact that we could end up in an unfortunate existence, that we have to do whatever we can to avoid those. The last 2 parts of the teachings in this level of the stages of the path really give us the means to accomplish a good rebirth. We know if we want to get a good existence when this life ends, we have to first of all take refuge, which means kind of putting our confidence in the 3 jewels, the Buddha, the teacher of these teachings who shared them with us some 2,500 years ago, the Dharma, the actual teachings he gave, and then what's called the Sangha. The Sangha are the spiritual community that we rely upon to guide us and help us on our path. So that's the first topic in terms of addressing this dilemma that we have, that we're going to die and we could end up in an unfortunate existence, is we find refuge. We take refuge in the 3 jewels as what will give us the tools we need to affect a change. And the tool that we need at this level is the next topic, the last topic of this first level, which is karma. Karma is a very complicated topic. We'll touch on it a little bit in this module, but not quite so much. But it is good to revisit karma just to understand how karma works within the understanding of emptiness. Because karma is perhaps one of the most important topics that the Buddha taught, because everything that we experience is a product of what we have done in the past. we create the causes for our future experiences. And this is a principle that is enacted in all of what we are trying to achieve on the path, whether we get a good rebirth or whether we try to achieve, again, a more lasting result. So those are the main teachings that are taught. In terms of the modules, it's module 5 that deals, well, module 4 first, that deals with the spiritual teacher. Then module 5 that deals with death and impermanence. Module 6 jumps a little bit to karma, but then we come back and get refuge in module 7. So there's quite a few modules of discovering Buddhism that deal with these topics that I just went through. Just so you know, in module 8 of Discovering Buddhism, some of you may have taken that. That's kind of one focused on how to develop a practice, an ongoing practice we can do daily to reinforce our study and practice of Buddhism. So that's a wonderful module to kind of get a more stable practice in your life. And then we go on to the second section of the Lamrim, the stages of the path, where we talk about the graduated path of the beings of middling capacity. The small capacity, all they were capable of kind of getting their heads around, in a sense, is to at least use the Buddha's teachings to get another good rebirth. At the middling level, we're looking at the bigger picture. We're looking at the reality that every one of us has been going from life to life in what's called samsara, this circling in existence through the power of our karma. And that karma has been generated by our afflictions and so on. I'm actually going to talk about this in more detail a little bit later tonight. But this is the process that we're all engaged in. That module is called Module 9, that covers this middle scope or middle capacity teachings, is called Samsara and Nirvana. And it's where we recognize that there is the possibility of attaining freedom from that. That this is what the Buddha says that we've all been caught up in, but the answers are there. The reality is that we can be free from that if we put into effect some very key teachings around, first of all, developing a solid foundation in morality. Upon the basis of that, building a deeper meditative practice, meditative stabilization, concentration. And then on the basis of that, increasing our wisdom. So even at that level, we do need to have the wisdom of emptiness in order to accomplish that. But we're not going to, the wisdom of emptiness is not taught then because we teach it within the context of the third level. But that second level is where we generate for ourselves the wish to be free from our own situation. They often say that if we don't generate a compassion for ourselves in our own predicament, how can we possibly have compassion for all beings? And that's where we go to with the third level. So just to put that back on the screen very briefly, this is where we kind of graduate to the graduated path of the beings of great capacity, the beings that have the greatest motivation. While the first two dealt with only our own situation of gaining a good rebirth for ourselves and then gaining our own freedom from this cycle of existence, at this level, we look to go beyond that. We generate the compassion that embraces the situation of all sentient beings, that wants to free them from suffering and bring them to their greatest potential. And the modules that, if you've been attending them recently, they would have been Module 10, where we look at the techniques for developing the mind that is intent on doing that. We just meditated on that briefly in the motivation tonight. We call that mind bodhicitta. Bodhi means awaken, citta, the mind of awakening, the enlightened mind, the mind that aspires to become a Buddha for the sake of all beings. That module is very rich in terms of giving us some amazing heart practices to strengthen our devotion and dedication to helping sentient beings. Then the last module that you did was transforming problems into happiness, transforming suffering. This is a more specific technique to enhance our bodhicitta by utilizing certain teachings that help us to transform whatever we meet, especially difficult situations, into a path of awakening, because we see that everything we meet has a lesson for us, has something that we can sink our teeth into if we look at it in a way that allows for that to happen. So that again are some very powerful teachings, what are called lojong in Tibetan. So those are mainly around kind of what we call the method side of the path. The fact that we need this bodhicitta motivation, this very compassionate, altruistic motivation to achieve Buddhahood. We need to look beyond our own needs and actually think about the welfare of all beings. Well, we often talk about how we have then this method side, if you will, that encompasses bodhicitta and all these various practices that are to help us to be of benefit to others. We need also the wisdom side. They often compare these to the two wings of a bird. This goes back to ancient Buddhist teachings where it was set out that we need both aspects of the path in order to get to the state of enlightenment, just like a bird needs both wings in order to fly to its destination. So, what we're going to be looking at in this module, and this is kind of quite specific in terms of focusing on this level of wisdom. We can say that there are many other wisdom teachings of the Buddha, but the deepest, most profound wisdom that the Buddha taught is the main one that encompasses the wisdom wing, is the main one that will undermine what is behind all of our problems and all of our difficulties. So this is a very important module because it's actually something also that is quite unique to Buddhism. We can talk about various practices around karma in some of the Eastern traditions, in the Vedic traditions, and so on. You can even talk about compassion and loving kindness and generating a good heart in many other traditions in the world, right? But emptiness is quite unique to what the Buddha taught. And I'll go into a little bit of the source of these teachings in a moment. But I wanted to share a little story with you that speaks to kind of the uniqueness of these teachings. I had the good fortune of attending some teachings with His Holiness in Paris in 2003, because I was living in Italy at our Center Istituto Lama Tsongkhapa, where I was studying in the master's program. And we had an opportunity for many of us to go up to Paris for this week of teachings. And at these teachings in this sort of Colosseum auditorium, there was one Christian monk, and there's many, oftentimes there are people from other traditions that show up at His Holiness's teachings because they want to, go see this wonderful being, right? Because His Holiness has an amazing reputation around our world. And this monk was quite stunning in these white robes that he was wearing. I mean, I was quite taken with just like his presence. And His Holiness at one point addressed him and he said, "It's so good that you are here with us and that you're able to, take some of these teachings. I really thank you for coming." And he says, then he went on to say, "And when I teach about compassion and loving kindness and, impermanence and some of these other things that are good for everyone to know," he says, that's great. You can be here. You can hopefully learn something from what I have to share. But when I talk about emptiness, that's none of your business." I mean, he wasn't being rude, His Holiness, by saying this. He was just simply saying that for someone who comes from another tradition where this isn't taught, it could be misinterpreted and it could be something that could be very dangerous. And I'm giving you that story as well because as we get into the teachings on emptiness, there always is that kind of cautionary thing. And that's because when we start bouncing these words around like emptiness and voidness, and it starts getting a bit nihilistic. And we aren't, that is one thing that we have to kind of avoid. And I'll be talking about that a little later in this course, is to make sure that we don't take these teachings as in any way negating existence. We have existence right in front of us. We're all here gathered together through computers, through being in the room here physically. We're all able to kind of attest to our own existence, right? Because we're here listening to teachings, using our minds, and so on. We can't deny our existence. It's just how do we exist? And this is what the wisdom of emptiness is getting at, is to really help us to be clear about what is going on in terms of our understanding of ourselves, of the world around us, and how we can correct things. Because the Buddha says that essentially we're making a huge mistake. In some ways, it's a kind of slight mistake, but it has huge consequences. If we don't correct this mistake, we can keep doing what we're doing, which is cyclic existence, just going from life to life, hanging out in samsara. I think Geshe Sherab on his Facebook page, when it says location, he says hanging out listlessly in samsara or something. I mean, we're all kind of doing that, right? We're all just kind of going from life to life. Isn't it time we put that all to an end? And moreover, isn't it time that we allowed for us to be able to help others to put that to an end through actualizing our deepest potential? So again, this course is to help you get acquainted with the concepts involved in kind of developing your own understanding of this very profound topic of emptiness. To think that, not like His Holiness says to the monk, the Christian monk, this isn't your business. This is our business. This is one of the things that we need to focus on as a key understanding for ourselves so that we can unlock our own minds through overcoming our ignorance and developing these greater qualities of wisdom and so on. But moreover, so that we can also help others. Okay, one thing that I do want to touch on a little bit in terms of one of the other kind of contexts for looking at this subject of emptiness, as well as even concentration that we're going to look at next week, is what's called the six perfections of a bodhisattva, sometimes called the six paramitas. Paramita is a Sanskrit word that literally means to transcend, to go beyond. And so the idea is that these are a way in which a bodhisattva's practice of these various things becomes transcendent, becomes kind of something that is in the realm of Buddhahood. It actually creates the perfect state of a Buddha, the state gone beyond of a Buddha. And these are, I don't know if these are taught by other teachers in Discovering Buddhism. When I teach module 10, which is how to develop bodhicitta, I mentioned this one earlier, I usually touch on this at the very tail end, just to at least introduce these six perfections. Because we don't go into them a lot in that module, but at least so people understand kind of what are the duties or activities of a bodhisattva. What's in the job description of a bodhisattva? Again, bodhi has the same root as bodhicitta. That means awakening. Sattva is a being of awakening, someone who is awakening their own potential. So the very first of these six perfections, and they are actually said to be set out in terms of they become more difficult the further out that you go. The very first one, as you can see there, is generosity. And I'm not going to go into great detail on each of these, but I think it's good to gain some understanding about the dimensions of them. Generosity is something that obviously we practice in many different cultures and in many different spiritual traditions, right? In Christianity, I grew up Catholic, it was called charity, right? And charity often has the idea of kind of giving some things. Material giving is an important part of it. In Buddhism, we also talk about giving protection, helping others to be safe from danger and fear and so on. But moreover, we talk about the greatest giving that we can do, which is the giving of the Dharma. So one thing as I'm introducing these six perfections is I might encourage you to bring these perfections into your study of this topic of emptiness. I'm using some teachings from one of my senior students that I learned from back in San Francisco, Thupten Pende, a wonderful former monk who did actually the Discovering Buddhism at Home module for this, or teachings for this module. Anyway, he said that the initial sort of motivation we can bring while we are engaging and receiving these teachings is think about gaining some benefit from them so you can give them to others. You might not feel qualified at the end of this to talk about emptiness to other people. And it's good maybe not to just talk about emptiness to anybody, like somebody you meet on the bus or what have you in the store, because most people, again, might misinterpret what these teachings are about. But if there is an opening and an opportunity to share these teachings, you want to be able to do that. Why? Because this teaching is one of the key ones that will, again, unlock our potential at the greatest degree. We need the teachings on emptiness. Again, I'll explain that shortly when I talk about kind of the roots of samsara and how this wisdom is essential. So that's the first of these perfections. The second of the perfections, I'll put them back on the screen again just as a visual cue, is morality. Now, how do we apply the practice of morality and the bodhisattva path? It means that we, first of all, do have a mind that wishes to stop harming other beings, which means we have to avoid what are generally called the non-virtuous actions. His Holiness the Dalai Lama often says, as bodhisattvas in training, we should do our best to help others. But if we cannot help them, at least don't harm them. This is kind of the bottom line of our morality, is to not harm other beings. Another type of morality that we engage in, though, of course, is to practice more virtuous actions, to engage in all the various things that the Buddha teaches that do create more positive potential for us. And there are a number of those that are, again, involved in helping us to do what's called accumulate merit, to develop great positive potential that acts as a force that helps us on our path. But the bodhisattva also wants to engage in the direct activities that benefit other beings, to actually be there and help them whenever called upon. So bodhisattvas are not people who think, oh, well, I'm going to wait till I become a Buddha and then I'm going to help others. That's how we actually help others, is by doing whatever we can now with whatever presents itself, where we have the ability, time, skills, whatever to be of benefit, that we actually take advantage of those opportunities. Well, how do we practice morality in terms of these teachings? Well, it's best to engage in these teachings without any non-virtuous states of mind. We might have to check up to see, is our motivation pure for being here? Or do we have some misguided motivation that thinks about the pride that we will have when we master these teachings, or other distorted ways of looking at them? Again, that may not be so prevalent in many of you. That's okay. That means you've got a good moral foundation. But we want to try to be free of any sort of conceit. And if you do find that the teachings are really clicking for you, for example, and you're really getting it, and you're going, wow, this emptiness thing, it's really quite easy. I don't understand what everybody's talking about. Well, then again, don't let that feed into any sort of conceit or pride. It's very possible that you've heard teachings on emptiness in a prior life, and this is kind of activating some of those seeds, and you're, having all the fruits of what you did in your past life ripen in this life. So don't take any conceit in that. Just acknowledge and be grateful that you are finding some ease. If you're finding it really difficult, of course, also don't have a mind that's kind of, upset at your qualities or your abilities and what have you. And that leads us into the third perfection. I won't put it back on the screen, the slide. This is the perfection of patience. We also don't want to get angry and upset at ourselves while we're going through this course. If you find that it is kind of a difficult subject and it's like chewing rocks or something, and you're really having a hard time of it, don't get angry and upset. There's no use and benefit to that. When we talk about patience as a practice of a bodhisattva, part of it is being able to endure hardships in our lives. Part of it also is enduring the pain, the suffering that others inflict on us. But one of the other levels of patience that we want to adopt is to also have patience in our practice of the Dharma, in our study of the Dharma. So this is where the practice of morality, this perfection of morality, can be adapted to these teachings very easily. All we do is try to be very kind of tolerant of what comes up. Excuse me for a moment. So that we don't get upset at ourselves or at the teachings or at the teacher. And we actually continue our practice and study of this, and just do whatever we need to do to understand it as best as we can. Again, some of you might find these teachings coming easier than others, but don't let that upset you if you're finding it difficult. The fourth one of the perfections is joyous effort, it's called. I'll put that on the screen again. Sometimes this is called perseverance, sometimes even enthusiasm. Perseverance sometimes sounds like a lot of hard work. There is this idea of persevering and making effort, but it's done with joy. It's done with this mind that is embracing this, with a lightheartedness, with a desire to do whatever we can to adopt these teachings, because we see that it leads to great happiness and good results for ourselves and others. So I'm not going to talk a whole lot about joyous effort, but know that there are many dimensions of it. It's the way that we kind of armor ourselves so that we can encounter any difficulty that requires us to have more stamina, more perseverance, and that it also becomes kind of a motivating force for us to be a benefit to others, to do whatever it takes to help them. Of course, with these teachings, we need some level of joyous effort. We need some level of kind of enthusiasm for these teachings, even when they are a little difficult. The last two, as you see on the screen there, and I'll take it off then, is concentration and wisdom. These are the two main ones that we're going to be talking about in this module, with the stronger emphasis, of course, on the perfection of wisdom. Remember, I said a few minutes ago that these get harder the further up you go. Concentration means the ability for us to make the mind very, very stable. If you did do the module on meditation, how to meditate, or if you've taken Buddhist Meditation 101, which is also a standard course that we offer through the center here, know that there are, again, two different types of meditation. The first, and the one that is embodied in this perfection for a bodhisattva, is the ability to remain on an object without any distraction. This is what we call our stabilizing meditation or placement meditation. The idea of making the mind very focused so that we don't get swayed away from whatever it is that we are meditating on. So tonight, when we began, we started with a stabilizing meditation, kind of bringing the mind to the breath and trying to keep it focused there. The breath is one of the main objects that we can use, but there are many objects. In fact, my teacher in Italy, Geshe Jampa Gyatso, said that anything can be used as a meditation object. We'll talk a little bit about this next week when I go over some of the basics around developing deeper concentration. But essentially, we want an object that we can focus on that will allow us to maintain a very steady, virtuous, joyous mind. The perfection of concentration for the bodhisattva is obviously something that they go about developing deeper and deeper levels of meditative focus, meditative stabilization. In terms of applying this to our teachings, it's good as much as possible while we are in the teaching to try to maintain single-pointed focus. And I'll talk a little bit more about the techniques for doing that next week. And when we go into what's called the steps to accomplish calm abiding. Calm abiding is a particular form of meditative stabilization that is a bit more advanced and does take some time and energy to acquire. But every one of us has the potential to achieve that. The bodhisattva, in terms of the perfection of concentration, achieves that. And they use a very stable mind as a foundation for the perfection of wisdom. The perfection of wisdom is usually in the category of the other type of meditation. The first one, again, is what we call stabilizing or placement. The second one is what we call analytical meditation. Analytical meditation is where we recognize that we have to kind of investigate things. If you've been coming to Discovering Buddhism for some of the previous modules, you've been using both of these types of meditation because meditations are assigned weekly and you analyze them. You spend time thinking about them. An analytical meditation, in some ways, is just a highfalutin term for thinking, contemplating, reflecting. This is an important step because we have to kind of begin to process the teachings, begin to take them and make them our own through our own investigation and analysis. So that the culmination or the apex of analytical meditation is when we start analyzing into the nature of reality, which is what the perfection of wisdom is all about, this sixth perfection of a bodhisattva. The perfection of wisdom, of course, is the real essence of what the Buddha taught in terms of the highest wisdom, the deepest, most profound truths that we can know. And in terms of our understanding or applying it to our this course, this is obviously kind of maybe self-evident. As we go through this, try to bring these teachings into your own understanding as best as you can. Part of that will be as you listen to the teachings. In fact, we often talk about 3 levels of wisdom. The very first one is the wisdom that we acquire simply through listening, hearing, or reading even. All of these that kind of bring the information in. That's already a level of wisdom. It's kind of comforting to hear that, right? Because sometimes we might put ourselves down and think we're not so wise. Oh, I've attended a lot of teachings, but I don't have any wisdom. Well, you have the wisdom that you acquired even by hearing these teachings. And that's wonderful. That's a good place to start because if you bring those teachings in, then you've got something to work with. That's the second level of wisdom. And that's kind of what most of our analytical meditation is right now. It's called the wisdom arisen from contemplation, from thinking, or sometimes called reflection. It's essentially where we sit down and we process the teachings that we've received through our hearing or through our reading. So anything that we kind of bring in as information, particularly on this topic of emptiness, we want to spend some time contemplating it. And again, as part of this, every week you're assigned a meditation to work with, and most of them, other than next week's meditation, are an analytical meditation, where you actually think through what the instructions are in the meditation. And I'll give a little guidance on doing that when we get to that later tonight. So the bodhisattva, again, kind of develops, oh, I'm sorry, we can go to the third level of wisdom. The bodhisattva will engage in the wisdom from hearing, the wisdom from listening, and then the third level is what's actually called the wisdom arisen from meditation. And you might think, well, but we're meditating now. Well, this is when we are able to unite our insight into these teachings together with that calm abiding that I just discussed, that we're going to go into in more detail next week. This is a more profound level of wisdom. It's not just the meditation that we have that can be a bit, scattered, that maybe isn't as continuous, because there we bring a very stable mind. And again, we do that analytical meditation within the stability of our minds. So the wisdom arisen from meditation is, in essence, the goal that we want to accomplish. This is how we're actually going to be able to change our minds. We can change our minds a bit just through hearing the teachings. We change them even more by thinking about them. But if you really want to change the fabric of your mind, if you will, you have to engage in the wisdom arisen from meditation, which means attaining calm abiding, which we're going to talk about next week, which is the essence of the perfection of concentration, and then special insight, this insight into emptiness that is the essence of the perfection of wisdom. So these last two get taught together very frequently. And in fact, in most Lamrim texts, they will talk about the six perfections in a very general way, and then they go into giving very detailed instruction about how to achieve calm abiding, and then, of course, how to achieve this insight, what's called special insight into emptiness. So that was a very long introduction to kind of the context for what we're going to be looking at in this module in terms of these six paramitas, these six perfections. Let me just see if there are any questions. And then because it's a 2-hour class, I do like to give just like a short little break so people can stand up and stretch a little bit, because 2 hours is long. But yeah, we do have the microphone for folks here in the Gompa, and Bill has a question first. And then those of you who are online, if you want to put your little hand icon up that's under reactions, that will allow me to know that you need to be called on as well. So Bill, please. Mhm. It would be wisdom arisen from hearing, listening. Yeah, good. Mhm. Yeah, and again, for the second one, for us now, and the meditations that we do, I'm speaking again with my own understanding that most of us probably don't have this high level of meditative concentration that we're going to discuss next week, that I've mentioned briefly, again, called calm abiding. Calm abiding, again, is a very stable mind where you've removed a lot of the faults to your meditation. For most of us, we don't have that level of stabilization. So, what we are doing in our sitting meditation, when you go through the meditations that are assigned for this module, for example, is more akin to the second level of wisdom, the wisdom that arises from processing, contemplating, reflecting, thinking. That meditation time that we spend isn't wisdom arisen from meditation yet, because we haven't made the mind quite stable. But nonetheless, it's what we call meditation. So it's, again, more akin to contemplation or reflection. Does that make some sense? So again, when we uh, actually attain what's called the wisdom arisen from meditation, it's done through what's called a union of calm abiding and special insight. When we have this very, or something very close to that, because there are, again, stages of developing it. If you get very close to that, that's what you need as a support for the mind, is a very stable mind. And then you introduce an analytical mind that is trying to develop insight, particularly into emptiness. And that will be the beginning of what we would call the wisdom arisen from meditation, at least in regard to emptiness. We do have the wisdom arisen from meditation for anything we study, right? For bodhicitta, for karma, for any of the topics. In fact, that's what the whole Lam Rim is about, is to give us the instruction on what we need to know. So that's the first, while we listen to or read Lam Rim teachings. That's the wisdom arising from hearing and reading, listening. Then we think about those teachings and meditate on them in our own way. That is not yet a very powerful, stable mind. Then once we develop that stable mind, we can generate the wisdom that arises from meditation. Okay. There's a wonderful piece on this. I think it's the third chapter of a book that's called something like Transforming Adversity into Courage by Geshe Japa Tekchok. Sometimes when I teach module 2 of Discovering Buddhism, I introduce that chapter and even have made copies of that chapter for people. Probably not supposed to do that without paying royalties or copyright fees or whatever. But anyway, it's a wonderful chapter that goes into these 3 types of wisdom and very clearly delineates them, but they build on each other, right? If you don't have the wisdom arising from hearing, how can you contemplate the teachings, right? Because you need to bring them in and have that raw data, if you will, to process. Then if you don't think about them, how could you possibly get to a place where you have a deeper meditative state that is realizing the teachings, right? So we need all 3, and they are built one upon the other. Any questions from anyone in the Zoom room? No? Okay. Well, then let's take just a short break. Again, so there'll be an opportunity at the end of class as well to ask any questions. What I'd like to do now is to give you a little bit of the lineage of these teachings. When Thupten Pende taught on this in his at-home teachings that he gave, he said that part of it was so that people would understand that there's some authoritative tradition, that he himself wasn't just kind of making things up. And I guess I can say the same thing, is so that you know that to the best of my ability, I will try to represent what these great masters of the past taught. But it is important to understand that these teachings do go back to Shakyamuni Buddha. And in fact, there are 3 main people who we can highlight as kind of the main carriers of this lineage, beginning with the Buddha. These are the 3 key figures, I'm calling them there, relied upon in these teachings on emptiness. Shakyamuni Buddha, these are the dates that are given in at least one website, but obviously we don't have exact dates for Shakyamuni Buddha, but it's before the Common Era, roughly about 500 years. So it's been 2,500 years or so since the Buddha gave us these teachings. I probably don't need to tell you the whole story of the Buddha's life, which I would do in a nutshell, but nonetheless, we do know from that records and things that have been left behind, he was born as Prince Siddhartha, and the story is that essentially he left home right around the age of 29 to seek a spiritual quest of sorts and to try to figure out what everything was about, having seen that samsara exists, the suffering that we have to experience through birth and aging and illness and death and so on. So the Buddha, Prince Siddhartha, on his quest actually met many great meditation masters. And in fact, the techniques I'm going to share with you next week, we can say come from the Buddha's learning of those through the Vedic traditions that existed at the time of the Buddha, the time of Prince Siddhartha. He studied with these great meditation masters with the hopes that what they were teaching would lead to moksha, freedom, freedom from suffering, freedom from whatever, the world of fault and error. But nonetheless, after practicing with many of them over the course of about 6 years, he was not finding the answer that he sought. And so he sat under what's come to be known as the Bodhi tree. Whether it's the actual Bodhi tree he sat under or an offshoot of it that's in Bodh Gaya now in India. This is the place, it said, where the Buddha actually attained enlightenment. We developed this deeper insight into the nature of things, and through the force of that became the Buddha, the awakened one. Well, over the course of the next 45 years, so from the time he was 35 until he was around 80, he taught many, many different ways. And you compare, again, I grew up Catholic, you compare the volumes of teachings that the Buddha gave to the bits and pieces in the New Testament that Christ taught, it's a huge, huge difference. And of course, the Buddha is said to be a very skillful guide in giving teachings according to exactly who was present, knowing that some people weren't ready for the really heavy duty teachings and some needed more provisional teachings. And therefore, when you go back and you look at everything the Buddha taught, you may even see contradictions or what appear to be contradictions. But they're not contradictions in the sense that they are taught for various individuals and for various stages of our own development. I'm not going to be able to, in this course, go through some of the other kind of preliminary views that the Buddha gave that lead us to this highest view that is taught. But nonetheless, we may have an opportunity to share a little bit of them here and there. The Buddha taught in what are usually called three turnings of the wheel of Dharma. These are kind of the way that we can encapsulate everything that he taught. And they do come somewhat chronologically, but nonetheless, we can say that the Buddha also overlapped these very much because the very first wheel turning was kind of the format for everything that the Buddha taught. It's the teaching on the Four Noble Truths, which again, I won't go into in great detail in this module because hopefully you've attended module 9 on samsara and nirvana, and that's the main topic that you look at there. But the Four Noble Truths are spelling out essentially the truth of the reality we're dealing with, what's called dukkha in Sanskrit. Dukkha means, it's translated as suffering, but it's bigger than that. It means dissatisfaction, that we're in an unsatisfactory state. Secondly, the noble truth of the origins of that, the causes of dukkha. Well, the causes of why we're in this situation are in our own minds. They're the afflictions and delusions, and then the fact that we act out of that. And I'll go into that again just a little bit later in more detail. The first two truths, then, in the Four Noble Truths, give us kind of the Buddha's view of what it is that we're actually engaged in. We could say that they encapsulate what we call samsara. The last two truths are pointing to nirvana. The third of these Four Noble Truths is the truth that there can be an end, a cessation of all of dukkha and all the causes of dukkha. Venerable Rabina, who many of you know, often says that this, in her opinion, this should have been the first noble truth. That the Buddha should have said, guess what, folks? You can all have an end to your suffering, an end to your dissatisfaction. But the Buddha taught the first two truths because he felt he needed to make us aware of our situation in a deeper way before developing that knowledge and understanding that we can be free from it. The fourth noble truth is the truth of the path, which is essentially everything that is embodied in the Lam Rim, in the stages of the path that I went through earlier. It's all the teachings that support our development of the wisdom that will cut through the ignorance that's at the root of our suffering, that is creating all of our afflicted states of mind, that is creating our karma, that is then creating our dissatisfaction, and so on. And I'll explain this in a little more detail in a few minutes. That was the first turning of the wheel of Dharma. The Buddha didn't go into emptiness in that first wheel turning. He didn't talk about it so much because his main point was to get people to develop this strong intention to re-examine their priorities in life, to really look at what they were engaged in and the fact that they want an end to this. They want to actually be free of this cycle of existence. So he did teach some coarser forms of selflessness at that point, or emptiness. It's in the second wheel turning, what's often called the turning of the wheel of lack of intrinsic existence or emptiness. These are what are called the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. So we just talked about the perfection of wisdom being this sixth perfection, the prajna paramita, prajna meaning wisdom, paramita meaning perfection. The prajna paramita sutras include the Heart Sutra that we recited at the beginning of tonight. Prajna paramita is the essence of the wisdom teachings on emptiness that the Buddha gave. And they're all encapsulated in that. There are longer versions of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, and then there's the shorter ones, such as the Heart Sutra, which, as you saw when we read that, the Buddha didn't even say much in it. You know, it was Avalokiteshvara who was saying all these profound words, and the Buddha just kind of at the end saying, it's like that, right? Kind of giving his seal of approval on what was said. But in many of the other Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, the Buddha does give somewhat terse instruction on this view of emptiness. And it is kind of interesting. If you go back to some of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, not just the Heart Sutra, but some of the other ones like There are the three mothers, they're called, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra in 100,000 stanzas, in 25,000 stanzas, and then in 8,000 stanzas. These sometimes are quite a puzzle to kind of gain the meaning of. That's why we need kind of other people to elucidate on what the Buddha said. Like it's perhaps at the time of the Buddha, the veils of ignorance weren't so thick for people and they were able to discern the meaning of what the Buddha taught quite readily. Nonetheless, a whole tradition, and we're going to go into those next, these other key figures that elucidated on that second wheel turning, on the Prajnaparamita Sutras. Just so you know, the third wheel turning was given chronologically later after the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, but it also included some additional topics. And it was kind of a teaching that is sort of in the middle, kind of giving people a little bit of a variation on emptiness that is very useful for certain people, but isn't the final word of the Buddha. But moreover, as part of that third wheel turning, the Buddha taught Buddha nature, which is actually what I'm teaching on Thursday nights here at Thupten Norbuling. Buddha nature is understanding that because our minds aren't sort of fixed and intrinsically existent, that we have the potential to change them, that every being has Buddha nature, that we all have the ability to transform our minds all the way to complete enlightenment. Very inspiring teaching. And so again, these three wheel turnings that the Buddha gave throughout his life give different flavors to the basic instruction that he was trying to impart to his disciples that could be carried on lifetime after lifetime and bring about the full transformation of human beings like ourselves into the state of enlightenment. Okay. The second key figure that came along some years after, before I go to this, though, I might actually mention that the teachings of the second and even of the third wheel turning were not as prevalent in the world after that. After the Buddha passed away at the age of 80, the main teachings that were disseminated were actually part of what's called the Pali Canon. The Pali Canon is what went into sort of Southeast Asia, Thailand, Cambodia, Burma, which is now Myanmar, and Indonesia, all that kind of area, Sri Lanka. Essentially, those were the main teachings that were disseminated. It's actually said that especially the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras were sort of skirted away, and there was a fear that they would be lost in this world. So they were kind of taken to, this is the legend that is told, they were taken to what's called the land of the Nagas. Nagas are kind of these serpentine beings, have kind of snake bodies and what have you. Again, this is a bit of mythology, if you will, but the idea was that the world wasn't quite ready for these teachings. They were waiting for someone who would come and elucidate upon the meaning of them so that beings could access them even more. So who was that person that they were waiting for? His name was Nagarjuna. He's the one who is said to have gone to the land of the Nagas to retrieve these teachings. You'll notice the snakes above his head there in this picture, this painting of, and that's a Naga in the ocean there, the sea there at his feet. It's said that Nagas are in the animal realm, but they have greater, kind of better karma than most animals. So they have kind of another, kind of like again a sea serpent sort of thing, but with greater good fortune than many beings who are born in the animal realm. His dates are very disputed. There are some people who profess that through various tantric practices, Nagarjuna was able to live like 1,000 years. But nonetheless, they place him in terms of where his teachings first appeared in the world around 150 of the Common Era to 250. So this is a good period of time after the Buddha had already passed away, right? It was right again in the beginning of the what would it be 5th century before the Common Era, and then now we're already into like the 3rd century of the Common Era when Nagarjuna is expounding upon the Prajnaparamita Sutras. But again, the story is that he went to the land of the Nagas and he brought these sutras back. And he began to write teachings. The best known teaching of Nagarjuna, though he's has written quite a number of works that are useful in our study of this view of emptiness. The most relied upon one is usually translated as the fundamental wisdom or the fundamental treatise on wisdom of the middle way. Fundamental wisdom is about 27 chapters. It too reads quite terse at times. By this word terse, I mean the words are quite succinct, and it's sometimes hard to get the full meaning out of it. Shortly after Nagarjuna passed away, there was a couple centuries later, actually, there was a great master, Chandrakirti, who wrote a great commentary on that text, other people who wrote commentaries on it. But nonetheless, we still have that text intact that we can understand this view of emptiness from Nagarjuna. So I will be bringing Nagarjuna's teachings in occasionally to kind of demonstrate some of what was taught in his way of expounding upon what the Buddha taught. And by the way, by that we're not saying that because Nagarjuna was required to expound on what the Buddha taught, that what the Buddha taught was somehow inferior. The Buddha taught it all. It's just that the way in which the Buddha taught and his time and the audience that was present was a very different audience than even those 7, 8 centuries later. Then even later after that, when the third figure that we're going to talk about appeared, and then even now when we're in the 21st century, and we've got a different kind of cultural milieu, we've got a different way of looking at things, and so on. What the way I see it, and again, this is maybe my own interpretation to some degree, is that we've gotten duller in our minds to some degree. What was happening in India at the time of the Buddha was really quite profound. India was like this hotbed of philosophical discussion, and the monasteries that formed in the wake of the Buddha's appearance were just outstanding. His Holiness often references Nalanda Monastery, which was in northern India, which was just like this amazing seat of learning. And this doesn't exist anymore. These sorts of places of learning, we do have monasteries, nunneries, where they do engage in that type of study and practice. But what was happening there was really quite special. So in these generations that have gone on, it's like beings have gotten a little bit duller. We've had maybe more influences in our world. We've got a lot of distraction, a lot of things happening. We need more and more detail to our teachings. So it's quite interesting. This third figure that many of you have heard of as well, put him on the screen, is a Tibetan figure. Again, because this is the tradition that we follow here, he's the founder of what's called the Geluk tradition that I mentioned briefly earlier. He's Lama Tsongkhapa. Lama Tsongkhapa lived from 1357 to 1419. These are quite definite dates because we do have much better recollection of dates through records and everything for these more contemporary figures, even though that's 600 years ago that he passed away. Lama Tsongkhapa was an amazing scholar. He spent an incredible amount of time trying to pursue these teachings on emptiness to really get at the fine understanding of it. It's not that other people hadn't written things about emptiness from between Nagarjuna and Lama Tsongkhapa, but he felt that there were some fine points of understanding that he really needed to explain. And he's, again, an incredible scholar and has left behind a legacy of amazing books, many of which have been translated into English now. We have as a footnote, sometimes we talk about how we live in a kind of a degenerate age, and even what I was just explaining talks about, to some degree, the way that our minds have degenerated. Geshe Sherab, in one of his teachings, he's the resident teacher here, many of you know him, he said that we actually can say that we're in a quite fortunate age, because look at how many teachings are available to us that were never available to us in English language, at least, right? Many of these texts you'd have to know Sanskrit to study, or Tibetan to study, or Chinese, and they have been translated into different cultures, but they haven't yet been made into English until our lifetime, essentially. We have many of Tsongkhapa's teachings now in English, including what is called his great treatise on the stages of the path, the Lamrim Chenmo, where there's a huge section on developing special insight that's really quite mind-blowing. It's a very difficult section, but it's wonderful the way in which he is able to elaborate on this. So again, we start off with the Buddha kind of giving these kind of basic sutra teachings in his Prajnaparamita sutras. Then we have Nagarjuna kind of explaining them again with an orientation towards making emptiness more accessible. But then we need Lama Tsongkhapa even to come along and give us even greater commentary on these, so that our modern minds can benefit from them. I mean, we're indebted to these beings, or else we probably would have a very difficult time just working with the sutras of the Buddha. Because there have been misinterpretations over time of what the Buddha was really saying when he said, for example, in what's said in the Heart Sutra through the mouth of Avalokiteshvara, form is empty, emptiness is form. That can be misinterpreted if we don't know exactly what the Buddha is saying by that. It gets into the whole kind of genre of what we call hermeneutics, of kind of understanding how we need to interpret what the Buddha said. Because the Buddha wasn't often kind of giving us the footnotes. He was giving us the straight line, this is how it is. And you have to kind of fill in the blanks and all the other information. So we're indebted to these amazing masters, and I just want to highlight the importance of them. And to the degree that I can, I will bring them into the teachings, though not with, again, a huge scholastic kind of orientation, just so you see how things are sort of repeated and elaborated upon by these masters. 4 other figures that you may hear about here and there in this course or in other books on emptiness, even the one that we're going to be mainly using for this course, is Aryadeva, who was a student of Nagarjuna's. He wrote a book that's called The 400 Stanzas that has been translated into English as Yogic Deeds of Bodhisattvas, I think is what it's called. Um, he kind of kept Nagarjuna's teachings kind of moving forward. Buddha Palita is the first kind of more extensive commentary on Nagarjuna's text that I mentioned, the fundamental treatise. He wrote, can't remember the name of it, it's just recently been translated into English through Wisdom. And he kind of set out what is kind of a really quite distinct view of what Nagarjuna was saying. It's come to be known as the consequence middle way point of view, the prasangika madhyamaka. Don't worry about the Sanskrit, but the consequence middle way school, which gives us a view of this middle way. This is a topic I'll be talking about in this course that helps us to discern exactly what emptiness is. Well, there was somebody who took a kind of issue with the way Buddha Palita put it out. His name is Bhavaviveka. He's not on the screen because he's not really teaching emptiness in the way that the Buddha intended in terms of the final view. Chandrakirti, who came around a couple centuries later, actually came back around to refute Bhavaviveka and say, no, Buddha Palita got it quite right. So actually, it's interesting. Chandrakirti is the one that's relied upon more even than Nagarjuna in the traditional Tibetan monasteries now. His text, it's called the Supplement to the Middle Way, is the main text that's used for examining emptiness in this tradition. Then the next century, the 8th century, is when Shantideva came along. Many of you know Master Shantideva. I've heard of him. He wrote a book called The Bodhisattva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, that is kind of giving this instruction on the perfections and how to engage in bringing the Buddha's teachings onto the Bodhisattva path. And the 9th chapter of that is a deeper investigation of the perfection of wisdom. And it's very well renowned as a kind of continuing in the vein of giving us this final word on emptiness. So that's just an overview of some of the figures that you're going to encounter, these great masters, mainly in the Indian tradition, but nonetheless, Lama Tsongkhapa of the Tibetan tradition. He had 2 disciples that very much followed in his footsteps that also wrote extensively about emptiness. We have, of course, our contemporary teachers, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Kyabje Zopa Rinpoche, Lama Zopa, our former spiritual director who passed away some months ago. We have other teachers that we've learned from, contemporary teachers, and I will quote some of them at times as well, who are sharing their knowledge. So know that I'm trying to stand on the shoulders of these giants. It's a long way up, but nonetheless, those are the folks whose teachings I'm trying to present as part of this course. And it is important to kind of acknowledge that these teachings do go back to the Buddha, mainly again in his second wheel turning where he taught the Prajnaparamita Sutras. So what I want to do with the remaining time that we have, other than spend a little time kind of going over the structure of the course and giving you some additional information on readings and things like that, is just to go back to this structure that I sometimes teach when I go through, or I almost always teach in some manner when I go through Module 9 of Samsara and Nirvana, because it's sort of the underpinning for why these teachings on emptiness are so important, and moreover, why we then need also this teaching on concentration and developing this very stable mind to realize emptiness. And that is embodied in this sort of structure that I've put together. I don't know, it's based on hearing a similar analogy from other teachers. I'm not that creative. In what I call the tree of samsara. And we're going to do this from the bottom up. We're going to talk about kind of how this tree works. This tree, like all trees, have roots, right? A tree without roots wouldn't be able to grow because it needs to be have a stable foundation. In this case, the foundation of this tree is the ignorance that clings to the I, meaning this personal self that we refer to, and all phenomena for that matter, everything that exists, to be truly or inherently existent. So, what do we mean by that? And this is, of course, the main emphasis of why these teachings are needed. Even if you are trying to achieve the result of your own liberation, you need to uproot the entire tree of samsara. You need to overcome this ignorance. This ignorance, the Buddha says, has been operative in our minds since beginningless time. Our minds have existed since beginningless time, and we've never been free of this ignorance. We've always had it operative in our minds. And the more that we, of course, have it, the more we keep planting the seeds for it, it just keeps regenerating itself. Now, of course, the question might come up, but where did it come from? And one answer I've heard from one teacher to that question is, well, if you were in a house that was burning and somebody came in and told you that, you wouldn't stop and go, but where did the fire start? And how did the fire start, right? You just get the heck out of the house. Because what's the point of being in a burning house? Okay. I know that isn't much of an answer, but the Buddha never answered this question because I suppose it's impossible to answer. If our minds are beginningless, if there's no initial point at which mind began, this phenomenon of our conscious awareness, then there is no moment when the ignorance that has contaminated our minds began. But going back to that subject of Buddha nature that I mentioned earlier, that the Buddha taught in that third wheel turning, that's the essence of that teaching, is to help us to understand that while we have been defiled by that mind of ignorance, while it has existed since beginningless time, it's not in the nature of our minds. The analogy that I often use when I talk about this, and this may be one that you may have heard back in module 1 when we talk about mind and its potential, is the analogy of a glass of water. If I had a glass of water here in front of you, you could see the clarity of the water, right? Because it's not polluted with anything. The nature of water is clear. But then if I went out into the parking lot here and I shoveled some scoops of dirt into it and mixed it all up, the water would become opaque. Clarity wouldn't be there any longer, right? At least in terms of its manifest state, you would mostly see the dirt. You'd be obscured to seeing the clarity of the water. But the clarity is still there in a sense. It just requires the causes and conditions to remove the impurities. And we, of course, have techniques for doing this with our culture, right? We have water purification systems where you can put the water through finer and finer filters and the clear water that you started with returns. Well, we never had clear water to begin with, is one of the difficulties of this analogy. It's not like we started with a clean, clear glass of water and somebody threw dirt in it, or we ourselves threw dirt in it. We've always had a dirty glass of water. That's not the nature of the water. The water is clear. It's the same with our minds. We've always had a clear mind, a mind that isn't in its very nature polluted by this ignorance or anything that arises on the basis of that ignorance. And all of that can be removed through the Buddha's path of purification, through the Buddha's path of being able to remove these by creating counterforces to them. Of course, at the level of this root of ignorance, what is the counterforce? Wisdom. Because this ignorance is not just kind of a not knowing, it's an actual misknowing. We're going to go into this in more detail 2 weeks from tonight when we get into our deeper investigation of emptiness and what it is, what it's refuting. We are actually misknowing how things exist. We're making a huge mistake whenever this ignorance is operative in our minds, which is most of the time. All right. So we need a wisdom that is a direct antidote to this, and not just something that, again, is very superficial. We need something that is very deep and penetrative so we can uproot the whole process. That requires, again, this union of calm abiding and special insight, a very deeply penetrative mind that is extremely stable and sound. And then the uprooting process can begin. So, this mind that is, as was in that description, let me put it back on the screen, that is grasping at the eye or other phenomena, clinging to those to be truly or inherently existent. These are the words we're going to examine in 2 weeks in terms of what is the meaning of that. But to satisfy your curiosity right now, it essentially means for things to be existing from their own side. In other words, having their own kind of self existence, being able to set themselves up. Another very useful term is independent existence, having an independent way of existing. We're going to see that one of the main reasonings to help us to overcome that is to see how things arise in dependence upon other things. They are not independent of other things. Okay, so let's go back to our little tree that's on the screen here still. We have the roots of ignorance. Then we have the trunk. And for this, I'm kind of essentially labeling the trunk as both the wholesome and the unwholesome thoughts that we cultivate within our ignorance. I mean, sometimes we call the unwholesome ones afflictions, but essentially they are referring to any of the negative states of mind, such as anger, such as jealousy, such as desirous attachment, such as greed, and so on. We have a lot of these different states of mind, different flavors. These are the unwholesome ones that develop in our minds. They are rooted in ignorance. We also have, though, our wholesome states of mind that are still rooted in ignorance. For most of us, because we haven't developed the wisdom that has overcome that ignorance, we are creating virtue and having good results and good states of mind still within that ignorance. That's because everything within samsara is rooted in that ignorance. Because we can engage in lots of virtuous things. We're all here in the human form right now, it's said in the teachings on karma, as a product of our virtuous deeds. In one lifetime prior to this, maybe just before or many lifetimes before, you engaged in a very wholesome action that ripened at the end of your previous life and propelled you into this human existence. That was due to a wholesome state of mind. But it was still together with ignorance because you're still taking rebirth within the tree of samsara. So that's what's kind of interesting about this. It's talking about our bigger situation. Again, because when the Buddha talked about the Four Noble Truths, that very first truth of the truth of dukkha, he didn't exclude anything in terms of what we are currently experiencing, good, bad, indifferent. It's all part and parcel of samsara. Even the pleasant things that we engage in samsara are still in samsara. They're still a product of our ignorance. A good product because we don't suffer as much, we have pleasant experiences, but they still are unsatisfactory at some level. Now, again, that's something if you did do Module 9 that you explored, is the fact that all of these pleasant experiences don't last. They changed. Think of the most pleasant experience you've had in this existence. Is it still with you now? Is it something you can rely upon in this moment? No, it's long gone, and we've gone on to many different types of experiences. So again, this trunk of the tree gives rise to kind of the wholesome and unwholesome thoughts, virtuous and non-virtuous thoughts that we have that are rooted in our ignorance. We can have virtue that's not in the ignorance. You cannot have non-virtue without ignorance. It's kind of an interesting thing. We'll talk about that maybe a little later. Yes, please, Jessica. You can have virtuous thoughts or wholesome thoughts that are outside of ignorance, that are not with ignorance. But you can never have unwholesome thoughts without ignorance being present. Okay, and we'll go into this in a little more detail because it is important to delineate and understand kind of the role that ignorance plays. We'll go into that probably in 2 weeks, not as much tonight. Kind of running out of time tonight anyway. So this is the trunk. Now we can also include in that, but it's not on my little chart, neutral thoughts. We do have neutral thoughts during our day, where there's just not much going on. It's sort of like the flatlining. And then we have the more positive and then we have the more negative. But, we do flatline on occasion where we just have neutral thoughts. They're not as important. Why? Because they create kind of neutral karma, neutral experiences. So let's kind of acknowledge that they're there, but we're not going to talk about them so much. The main ones we're going to talk about are these kind of two poles of the wholesome thoughts that bring about virtuous karma. That's the branches of the tree. From the trunk, which are the main thoughts that we're generating within our ignorance, we create karma. Karma can be created solely by our mind, wholesome thoughts becoming virtuous karma, unwholesome thoughts becoming non virtuous karma or actions. But we can also do that with our speech. We can also do that, of course, physically with our bodies. So those are karma. Again, I'm not going to go into a huge description of karma. Hopefully, you've studied Module 6 of Discovering Buddhism and have a good idea of what we mean by karma. It's this sort of energy that we create primarily through our minds, but manifests again often in our body and speech. Then, when we look at the fruits, and the one thing in finding this graphic on the internet that I would have liked to have changed, and maybe someone who's kind of a master with Photoshop or something could do this, but is to change part of these fruits to maybe kind of something unappealing, maybe a really gross sort of color. Because we see that there are fruits that are not so pleasant, what we often just call suffering, not in the larger sense of suffering, but in unpleasant, painful experiences. And then we have happiness from our more virtuous states of mind and actions that follow from that, right? This is what happens within samsara. This is why we're experiencing what we're experiencing. In this human life, that was a product of a virtuous karma that came from very wholesome thoughts that was still rooted in our ignorance, that is giving rise to a good rebirth within samsara and all the good things we have within that rebirth. Being born in a developed country where we have a bounty of resources, where we have a good culture to support us in our learning and development. All these things are things you've created through your own wholesome states of mind, but still within the root of ignorance. Unfortunately, there are those beings who've created miserable existences. And of course, we all have miserable experiences within even our good existences. But all of those are a product of our non virtuous actions, our non virtuous karma that come together with our unwholesome states of mind that, again, are also rooted in ignorance. So, the way this tree of samsara works is it gives us the big picture that everything we're experiencing in samsara, because again, there also is neutral karma and neutral experiences. But when we look at this primarily from these two poles of what is pleasant, what is unpleasant, all of those are created through our own minds and through the states of mind that are all rooted in ignorance. So guess what, folks? If we ever want to be free from this whole thing, or help others to be free by becoming a Buddha, we have to undo this ignorance. We have to eliminate it. It's the root of all of our problems. And again, we won't go into detail about what that is tonight, this sort of grasping. The main one that Chandrakirti and some of these other great masters say that is driving the propelling from life to life is this grasping at this I, capital I, the sense of a person that we are so tightly holding on to as real. I use that word real because Lama Zopa often would use real in describing this false sense of I. Again, in 2 weeks, we'll go into more detail about what that really kind of looks like. Because it's really important that we understand what this ignorance is doing. How is it misperceiving things? That's going to be one of the most crucial steps that's already even pointed out in the introduction to His Holiness's book that I hope you read over the next week. Because that's what we have to undo. If we're ever going to develop, remember in the motivation earlier, I talked about how we have the high status, high rebirth. You can get that through never touching your ignorance, right? You just create more wholesome thoughts that create more virtuous karma that produce more delicious fruit. And you'll get good rebirths in samsara till the cows come home, right? As we used to say in the Midwest. So that's no problem. If you're going to create the second type of result, and what I called definite goodness or certain goodness, that means liberation or enlightenment. You have to uproot this ignorance. Of course, with getting enlightenment that goes beyond just mere liberation for oneself, there are other causes, bodhicitta, the other perfections, all of these kinds of practices of a bodhisattva, because you have to do more to create more merit and cut through even subtler obscurations in the mind that go beyond ignorance. And we'll touch on those perhaps a little bit later in this course. That's kind of an overview of why these teachings are so crucial and why, through the kindness and compassion of these great masters that I talked about, we have these teachings available to us, accessible to us. And while, yes, they are somewhat difficult to get our heads around and to kind of understand the meaning, we're at a really amazing point, as I said with Geshe Sherab's quote, that we're actually living in a very adventitious and, I'm sorry, that's not the right word, advantageous is the word I was meaning, and beneficial place in history, where we've got all of these teachings that we can access in our language. We don't have to go study, Sanskrit or Tibetan or whatever to get at these teachings. They're there in English for us. Sometimes the English is a little, a little difficult. Different translators translate some of these texts with different, terminology. So again, part of this course will be getting clear about what we mean by certain terminology. But and the whole gist of it is to help us to deepen our awareness through developing these 3 levels of wisdom and eventually overcoming our ignorance. So let me see if there are any questions, and then I'll just do a brief introduction to some of the other materials and things. Any questions on what I talked about tonight? Yes, please, Josan. Get the microphone to her, and yeah, that's all right. That way the folks at home can hear, and I don't have to repeat to them.
In the very beginning, and just now you touched on the second definite goodness. What are the 3 parts of the motivation from Buddha? Those are the 3.
Okay, so if we say that there's on this hand high status and definite goodness, right? High status, when we talk about the Lam Rim over here, remember when I went through the 3 stages, they pair up the first and the first completely. So to get high status, you engage in the first level of the stages of the path. It's about gaining a good rebirth. Okay. In terms of definite goodness means a state that will be lasting, that you couldn't degenerate from. When you get a good rebirth, you can very well muck it up and end up in an unfortunate state. So that refers to the results of the middle and the great stages of the path, which refer respectively to liberation. By that we mean self-liberation, one's own personal nirvana, one's freedom from suffering. And then the other one is enlightenment or Buddhahood, which is where you go beyond your own personal liberation to achieve this greater goal of Buddhahood, where you can then be just like Buddha Shakyamuni and teach others perfectly according to their karma and so on. So that's how they pair up and work with that. Sure. Any other questions or comments? I know it's a lot of information that I put up. In discovering Buddhism, I often like to just maybe make a couple of points in each class, and I'll try to do that in the future, but this is a big topic. So, okay, there's a question online from Deb. What if existence isn't mundane but extraordinary? Is it still samsara? I guess we'd have to look at what is meant by extraordinary. And we often use the term supra-mundane, supra meaning above, beyond mundane. We do not know what a supramundane experience is. In fact, they say you don't know. I'm speaking for myself here. Maybe I don't know all of your minds, but you don't have what's called a supramundane mind until you have a direct insight into emptiness, meaning until you have a non-conceptual awareness of emptiness that is based in a very solid meditative state and goes beyond our conceptual awareness. I'm going to talk about that as part of this course a little bit later. So when we use the word extraordinary, if it's still extraordinary solely in terms of the experiences of this life, but is not something that goes on to beyond this existence, then it can't be supramundane. It's only mundane still. So I guess we'd have to look at the meaning of what you say from in terms of what extraordinary means. Those who are practicing the path, whose lives become a lot less difficult because they're generating good karma, they've got bodhicitta motivation all the time, these wonderful bodhisattvas obviously are having more karmically fortunate lives. But until they generate that wisdom, realizing emptiness at that level, they don't have anything that kind of transcends beyond this world, that goes above this world, beyond this world. So we would, in answer to that, if we were just talking about extraordinary, meaning something that is still somewhat conditioned, then it isn't super mundane. It would still fall in the category of mundane. So if there are no other questions, I just got a few minutes left, but I do need to spend a little time. And if you do have some other questions that are still coming up for you, then by all means, write them down, send them in to TNL, to the Buddhist Center here, or hold on to them for next week. There will be an opportunity to have questions answered. I'd like to create enough time for that. Sometimes I'm not so good, and if I kind of am going on and I'm not giving time, please let me know, because I also like to end on time so that people aren't sort of hanging out, wondering when things are going to end. I want to go to the website for the Buddhist Center TNL, Thupten Norbuling, and this is the page. I'm not showing you this so you see my picture. I'm showing you this so that you know, again, that there's this wonderful course materials link that's right in the center there. If you click on that, you will go to many of the documents that you will need for this. What I would like to do is to show you a couple of these documents that are the more important ones, perhaps to print out more initially or to at least download so you can access them. The first one is the course outline, kind of on my screen. It's like towards the bottom there. This is going to give you a good idea of what's going to be covered in this. There's a wonderful quote from Lama Zopa at the top there. Each of these sessions kind of is detailed in terms of the main topic I'm talking about. Next week, again, more about developing concentration to strengthen the power of our wisdom, undermining fundamental ignorance in the following class, especially through the reasoning of dependent arising, then next through the reasoning of the 4-point analysis, and then finally going into kind of how things do exist and understanding what are called the two truths. And then in the final class, we're going to catch up on any things we've kind of maybe not completed, and then look at how we apply some of these teachings in everyday life. Try to keep this very practical. So again, that's one document that I would encourage you to be referring to at times. Another one is what's called, it was up at the top, I think, actually, the reading list. This is, I know that they do have out there the reading list that the FPMT has put together, but I also have some kind of suggestions for this, that a more specific one in particular with the book that His Holiness wrote with Jeffrey Hopkins. The first one is the general reading materials, which again are out there as well at the same site that I'm going to, the course materials site. How to See Yourself as You Really Are is this wonderful book by His Holiness. It was quite a few years ago, and I've been using this for discovering Buddhism. To me, it's the best beginning emptiness book that has been written. Admittedly, it's still a deep subject, but it's really quite nice if you can download it, purchase it somewhere, or buy it as a paperback, whatever. I mean, it's not so expensive, but I would really encourage you to read this book with us as we go through each of these sessions. And I'll show you in a moment how those are kind of split out by session. There's also selected teachings from one of the books by Lama Zopa that deals with emptiness, as well as a second one, both of these published by the Lama Yeshe Wisdom Archive. You can download them in PDF or other formats, Mobi, what have you, from Lama Yeshe Wisdom Archive at these links. And all you have to do is click on the links from there. Sometimes when you download it, the links may not work quite as well, but you can always paste them into your server. But those two books, and then of course, Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand, which is a book that we've been using for discovering Buddhism for previous modules. It's a Lam Rim, a Stages of the Path book, and there's wonderful teachings in there from Pabanka Rinpoche. Those are the ones that we call kind of required. If you don't want to read all these things, that's okay. Yeah, I'm not going to, nobody's holding your feet to the fire on this. You do whatever level of engagement that you want to do. This is if you really want to fully engage in it, or especially if you want to get what's called certification, which means fulfilling all the requirements for discovering Buddhism. I put together a very short optional reading list with 3 books that I think are quite useful. Admittedly, they get more advanced as you go through these 3. The first one is probably the most approachable, by Geshe Tashi Sering, and then How to Realize Emptiness is a little more difficult, and that actually was one book we used to use for discovering Buddhism, this module. It's really quite difficult. Insight into Emptiness is the most difficult because it's very vast, but it's a wonderful book by Geshe Dampa Tekchok. All right. Let's go then to the third one that's most important, and that's knowing where these readings and meditations are assigned, because there also are meditations that are assigned. That's this file. When I teach this, rather than just saying, oh, you've got all these readings to do and you've got a whole book, I like to give you some direction. So you can parse it up over the 6 weeks that we're meeting, all right? So for every class, I'm giving you the reading to do for the following class. Some of it is going to be a review of what I talked about tonight a little bit, but essentially I want you to do the reading on here if you have the time to kind of get your mind ready to hear the teachings next week. Alternatively, if you want to come to the teachings next week without having done the readings, that's your choice, but you might find the readings that are there useful to do after next week's teaching. But keep that in mind. The assignment from class 1 is what to do in preparation for class 2. Again, that video is an overview. It's not necessarily preparation for next week, but you'll see that there are various readings. There's His Holiness's book. There's this short teaching on calm abiding that is also at the course materials and so on. Then there's a wonderful little meditation here. And so let me show you the meditation. I'm not going to go through the rest of these classes. You can, do that on your own. The meditation for this week is just to get you around kind of working with this idea of there's this kind of false sense of a self, of an I that we have. This is a meditation Thupten Pende put together, and it's a little long. And the way I encourage people to work with these meditations, if you haven't done them before, is to read them through in their entirety first. That way you kind of know what's going to happen. And you maybe even as you go through a second or third time, highlight a few key sentences or thoughts, phrases, whatever. Then you have that in front of you. And when you do your analytical meditation, first do a little stabilizing on the breath, then do an analysis by reviewing the points that are in that meditation. And the analysis is just, again, a thinking process, contemplating the teachings based on what is set out in that written meditation. All right. So I think that's the main things I wanted to cover, just to let you know that there is some structure to all of this. There's one final document that I might point out before we conclude tonight, and that's so that you just know that if you would like to do this, you're welcome to do what's called an assessment. I have put together what are like 10 assessment questions. I think there's an 11th one that's more or less kind of what effect did this module have on your Buddhist practice and what have you. There it is at the very bottom. The assessment questions, you're welcome to kind of have them in front of you as we go through. They're kind of set out in terms of the order of the topics that we're discussing. And if you would like to do this as a formal assessment at the end, there's instruction about doing that at the very beginning, at the top. And again, this is just for those who would like to do it to test their own knowledge, or for those who are doing it for certification. And assessment is a part of the process so that we gain some knowledge and understanding of what you gained from the course. But again, it's not really like a study all night for 2 weeks and then do an exam. It's really quite liberal. You can come into it with materials on hand, but primarily try to do the assessment from your memory, from the things that you've studied and retained. All right. Any questions on any of that? I hope I covered everything that needs to be covered. I'm not sure I did, and if not, then I'll start with that when we begin next week. All right, let's just do a very quick dedication. Dedication, as most of you know, is kind of at the end of our teachings. We want to make sure that we don't lose all this positive potential, that it goes to bringing about the best result, the complete enlightenment of ourselves and all sentient beings. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. And then one more prayer. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. All right, thank you all very much for joining tonight, and I'll look forward to seeing you at next week's class. And if any questions do come up, again, try to get to me. I've got my email address on that one sheet, the assessment questions, so you can email me even if there is something that you're not clear about. But I hope you find this module useful in your study and practice. So I'm looking forward to it. All right. Thank you all who've been
Thank you.
online and here in the Gompa. I'll see you next week.
Thank you.